Well, hello again. I remain Mr. Laskowski. I'm your host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. Well, we have reached the biggest chapter in the textbook, and it stands to reason that this will probably be the longest presentation of the year, even though I have split it up into two different parts. The good news for you is that in this case, we are like the United States. If we can make it through the Civil War, truly we can make it through anything. And so, as we go through the war, I'll have to admit there will be lots of blood and lots of death and lots of bleak moments for the soldiers, for political leaders, and for the United States of America as a whole. I'd encourage you to try to avoid getting caught up in the uncertainties or the inconsistencies of the war, what German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz called the fog of war. Instead, focus on the larger narrative and look for the major themes and even some of the truly spectacular world changing moments, because they're there if you can see through the fog. And as you do, remember to take great notes on this presentation, as it will help you on a future homework assignment and in preparation for an upcoming test, whenever that should happen to take place. The better your notes, the better your understanding of the Civil War, and of course, the better you will do. So let's get right to it, shall we? Unlike more esoteric aspects of American history, like the Second Great Awakening or the Webster Ashburton Treaty, everyone, and I mean everyone, has an opinion about the Civil War. And that's great, because talking about history is the first step toward learning from it. And it's not so great because people sometimes approach the subject with an agenda or a bias or a conclusion that they've already reached, regardless of whether it's based in fact or not. Well, in this class, we deal only in facts, aside from the occasional Texas tall tale, but mostly facts. So it's probably important for us to clear up some things right off the bat. And the first is to try to come up with an answer to this question: what is the cause of Southern secession and the resulting Civil War? Of all the great questions in American history, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, this one is probably the most hotly debated and the most contentious question of them all. And people's answers often have less to do with reason and facts and data and more to do with where they're from or who their ancestors were or the lens through which they see the world. And I sometimes like to imagine Americans on opposite sides of a football stadium thinking about this question and answering it by shouting, with one half of the audience shouting slavery and the other half of the audience shouting states' rights, and neither side listening to the other. So let us agree on a common answer to this most perplexing question. Of course, it's complicated. But let's not just leave it there. Let's see if we can dig a little bit deeper into this question. And doing so requires us to look at the word cause. What was the cause of secession and the war? And as much as I'd like to give you a one word answer to that question, the reality is it's actually two different questions. First, what is the proximate or immediate cause of secession? And second, what is the underlying cause of secession? Now, answering these questions will get us a long way toward understanding the Civil War. So, what was the most immediate cause of secession? It was the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in November of 1860. 1 month later, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and in all, 7 states left the Union prior to Abraham Lincoln even leaving Illinois to come to Washington to take office. But why was Lincoln's election the trigger? And that is where we get to the underlying cause. Here you have to understand a little bit about how politicians in slave states saw their world. Whether they believed slavery was a positive good or a necessary evil, they recognized that stopping the spread of slavery into the Western territories was the first step toward the abolition of slavery everywhere. If slavery were barred in the territories, as free soil Republicans like Abraham Lincoln favored, they eventually might have free territories become free states. And eventually, the number of free states would outnumber vastly the number of slave states, at which point, eventually, I've said that word a lot, Congress might be able to simply legislate slavery out of existence, or maybe even pass a constitutional amendment outlawing slavery. Eventually. But it was this fear that it was in the inevitable end game of a free soil president like Lincoln to end slavery altogether, to roll it back and abolish all slavery everywhere. It meant that states felt like they needed to take their enslaved people and get out of the Union while they still could, which they did, or at least they tried to do. And while it is clear that slavery is at the heart of these Southerners' fears, if you look carefully at this underlying cause, you can also sort of see the kernel of the argument that people make when they try to say that secession was more about states' rights. So let's take a look at that more closely. Could we just say that secession and the war were really actually at heart just about states' rights? That is, states deciding to do what they want with the place where they are and decide their place in the Union while they still had the power to do so? Is that possible? Well, the answer is predictable. It's complicated. Sure, it's possible to make the states' rights argument, and people have been doing it for 150 years, but it's important for us to dig a little bit deeper. The states' right argument boils down to this: states wanted to decide for themselves what laws and what values should govern them. And it's true that states did want to protect their rights. But the states' right to do what precisely? And the answer to that is to maintain the institution of slavery against any limitation or abolition imposed upon it by the national government, even if it might not happen for decades. And so, yeah, secession and the war are kind of about states' rights, but a state's right to continue practicing slavery. And so, why isn't it just about some philosophical debate about the nature of government and whether sovereignty rested in the states or in the national union? That's a fair question. And as if we've already studied several times, in which the states' rights argument has been made. But the difference is, at any of those previous times, no one has ever seceded. For instance, over the issue of the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, no one seceded. Or the War of 1812, no one seceded. Or the Tariff of Abominations, no one seceded. Only this event, the election of a free soiler in the 1860 election, caused the southern states to pull the plug on our national union. Sure, it's states' rights, but the simple truth is this: the one thing you cannot remove from the equation and still have secession and a civil war is slavery. So let's interrogate this election of 1860. As you might remember, Democrats split in two over whether to support a policy of pro slavery or popular sovereignty. And a tiny group of old no policy Whigs got together to create the Constitutional Union Party so that they could avoid talking about slavery. And these factions allowed the Republican Party to unite because they were all divided. The Republican Party was able to unite around one candidate and therefore win the election. That candidate was Abraham Lincoln and his doctrine of free soil. And that's how he was able to claim victory in the Electoral College, despite the fact that Lincoln, as you can see, only earned about 40% of the popular vote. And I'd like you to take a minute to think about that. 6 out of 10 voters in 1860 pulled the lever for someone other than Abraham Lincoln. And yet he won the Electoral College pretty handily, and thus the presidency. Now, you might be thinking, isn't it risky for someone to get elected in a year ending in a zero? What about that curse of Tecumseh? And actually, rumors of an assassination plot in Baltimore convinced Lincoln to adjust his travel plans so that he could get to Washington, D.C. and take the oath of office without any unnecessary bullet holes or stab wounds. But by the time Lincoln did take that oath of office, 7 states, as I mentioned, had already seceded from the Union. South Carolina, because trouble always starts in South Carolina, along with Georgia and Florida and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, pretty much the all of the SEC. So why were they in such a rush? Well, it's because, as we've noted, electing a free soil Democrat, free soil Republican like Abraham Lincoln meant that, in their mind, slavery's days were numbered. Sure, Republicans said they only wanted to stop the spread of slavery, but then what? If a house divided against itself cannot stand, and I read that somewhere, then surely it will one day become all enslaved or all free. So Southern states figured best to get out now and protect our hallowed institution of slavery. And of course, here I think it's important to ask whether Southern states were right to be afraid of the future of slavery, afraid for the future of slavery. And I think maybe we should ask the new president himself. Because in his inaugural address, which only happened because he didn't get assassinated by pro slavery conspirators, Lincoln said outright, I have no purpose in interfering with slavery where it presently exists, which is the Republican Party line. But then he added this little nugget of brilliance. I like the words Lincoln used to describe the Southern states here, the ones that had seceded already, as dissatisfied countrymen. As in, I understand that you're dissatisfied, but you're still my countrymen because secession is illegal. He said, in your hands, not mine, my dissatisfied countrymen, lies the momentous issue of civil war. And he went on to say, you cannot have war without you yourselves being the aggressor, which is his way of saying, we won't fire the first shot, but if you do, then we'll have no choice but to defend ourselves. And as we'll see, Southerners were all too happy to fire that first shot. But doing so does undermine the argument that some snarky Southerners like to make when they call this Civil War the so called War of Northern Aggression. I'm sure you're pretty shocked to hear that the side that lost the war might try to reframe the discussion by ignoring slavery, propping up the states' rights argument, and then claiming that the North was the aggressor. But we'll get there and deal with all of those things in detail. As I mentioned earlier, 7 states in the Deep South seceded before Lincoln's inauguration, and they quickly realized that if they held on to their state sovereignty and acted as 7 different independent nations and republics, well, the United States Army would just come in and pick them off one by one. So, out of military necessity, the states banded together to form a new government, a new national government, and they called it the Confederate States of America. Okay, pause. You might recall that one of our great historical truths is that confederacies never work. So you might be tempted just to skip to the end of this presentation and find out if it's true. But before you do, consider why Southern states would choose this mode of government, this type of government. The election of Abraham Lincoln had put him at the head of a federal government. And if you remember, a federal government has sovereignty over the states. And that's true. Read Article 6 of the Constitution if you don't believe me. And that sovereign federal government could take away each state's enslaved people if it wanted to. So if you're going to break away and start a new country, probably you shouldn't replace one federal government with another. Create I don't know, a confederacy in which states retain their sovereignty and no one can tell any of the states what to do. Sure, it's a recipe for chaos and disorganization and probably failure, but it is their choice to be chaotic and disorganized. And they'll hope that they don't fail. Very quickly, the Southern states went about building a new nation state, first settling upon Montgomery, Alabama as the provisional capital of the Confederacy, and then asking former Secretary of State Jefferson Davis to serve as the president of the CSA. And actually, I really like this picture here on the left because it shows the very moment when Jefferson Davis, up there on the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery, took the oath of office. He pledged to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. But what was in that Constitution? I'm glad you asked. If you recall the United States Constitution, you might remember the calligraphy and the fine parchment. The Confederate Constitution kind of looks like it was scrawled on loose leaf paper. And the Southerners didn't, maybe the Southerners didn't have time for, a lengthy constitutional convention and writing and rewriting and editing and re-editing. So they essentially plagiarized the United States Constitution, making a couple of significant changes. First, they reminded everyone that in a confederacy, each state retains its sovereignty and independence. And then, perhaps because they knew a war was coming, they asked God to bless and protect their undertaking. We'll see how that turns out. Now, while it is true that the Confederate Constitution expressly protected the rights of citizens to enslave people, you might be convinced that the Confederacy was more about states' rights than about slavery. But we should probably let the Confederates speak for themselves on this issue, including another person who was in that picture at the Montgomery State Capitol that day, one who got inaugurated as the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens. I'll share the most famous selection from his most famous speech in just a minute. It's the one we call the cornerstone speech for obvious reasons. But I do want to warn you first. These words are tough for me to say, and they might be tough for you to hear or even read. But they do get to the heart of the CSA and why it was created. Stephens said, "Our new government is founded, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that and I hope you'll excuse me for not saying the word out loud here that he used, that black men is not the equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Yes, it's true that the Confederacy was created to protect states' rights, but a state's right to maintain this institution of slavery. Don't take my word for it, take Vice President Stephens's word for it. Now, while 7 states left the Union, the other states where slavery was practiced, they had not yet decided on their answer to this immortal question posed by the post-punk rockers, The Clash: should I stay or should I go? Look at all those question marks here on my crudely drawn map. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. These states practiced slavery, and they might not have been as immediately threatened by Lincoln's election as the further south states had, but they did have much in common with those secessionist states. They were southern or rural culture, a suspicion of governmental power, and perhaps most importantly, these states all practiced slavery. And so they wanted to see what Lincoln would do, essentially threatening to join the secession movement themselves if Lincoln did anything to bring those Confederate states back into the Union. So talk about a no-win situation. Lincoln had just taken his oath of office, the one in which he promised to uphold the Constitution that had included a section saying that national law would reign supreme over the states and that the states couldn't defy the national government. However, if he actually did this and upheld the Constitution by trying to force Southern states back into the Union, he might lose another 6 or 7 or even 8 states to secession. So when Arthur Schlesinger made the times at which he served as one of his 3 standards for presidential greatness, it was for a moment precisely like this, right? How would Lincoln respond in this moment? And how could he get Southern states back without appearing to be the aggressor and driving other states out of the Union? And so here is an interesting question that we should take a look at because it informs Lincoln's response. Is a federal fort, is it on state land or is it federal territory on federal land? Because if a fort, like a U.S. Army fort or like that, is on state land, well, then if a state secedes, then the land where the fort is secedes with it, and the federal soldiers there need to abandon that fort. However, if a fort is actually federal territory, or national territory, if you will, then the land where the fort is doesn't secede when the rest of the state around it does. And this is just essentially a federal speck surrounded by a state land, and it's entirely isolated like that. So is a fort federal territory or is it state territory? And the answer to that question prompts the first shots of being fired in the Civil War. When the states seceded from the Union, most of the forts that had been that throughout the South, and you see stars of them right there, most of them had been run by Southerners, so it was easy just to convert these U.S. forts into Confederate forts. However, two forts were commanded by Northerners. One was in Pensacola, Florida, but the much more important one was Fort Sumter in the middle of Charleston Harbor. That's right, South Carolina, the cradle of rebellion, just a couple of miles away from where those first votes for secession had been taken. And for Southerners, capturing Fort Sumter was number one on the to do list. And for Lincoln, it was federal land that needed to be held on to in order to fulfill his oath of upholding the Constitution, which had forbidden secession. And if it seems like Lincoln is in a no win situation here, it's because he is. Surrender and fail to uphold your oath, fight and perhaps drive 8 states out of the Union. And so, what would Lincoln do? Well, here he chose a third option to resupply the fort, not rearm it. Essentially, he said, we will send food and blankets to the fort, isolated as it is in the middle of the harbor, but he would not send weapons or anything else that might seem provocative. And on the surface of this solution that Lincoln had sounds like a really clever way to avoid both other bad options. But to the Confederates, the only thing that they would accept is immediate surrender. And when that didn't come, well, they opened fire in the early morning of April 12th, 1861. Now, if Lord and Lady AP like beginnings, turning points, and endings, well, here is your beginning. Now, Fort Sumter wasn't really much of a battle, and it certainly didn't last long. After just a couple of hours, the Northern commander of the fort realized that the situation was hopeless, and eventually he was forced to surrender. And this picture shows the scene later that same day when, amid the debris from artillery blasts, the Confederate national flag was hoisted over Fort Sumter. And so from this moment here, we can say the war is on. Now, people often think that it was the firing on Fort Sumter that drove the other border states like Virginia and North Carolina to join the Confederacy, but in actuality, it was Lincoln's response to Fort Sumter that sealed the deal. Once he realized that Southerners were willing to fight their way out of the Union, he issued a call for a whopping 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Now, considering that nearly 10 times that many of people ended up dying in the Civil War, Lincoln's naivete here is almost adorable. 75,000, volunteers. That ought to suffice. And it clearly didn't. But what it did do, this call for volunteers did, was to convince Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee that they were about that the war was about to be real, a real true war, and so they figured out they had to choose a side, and so they chose to join their fellow Southern slave states in secession. Now, other states stayed, like Missouri and Delaware and Kentucky. They opted not to leave the Union. In addition, the western counties of Virginia, those that did not have as many plantations or enslaved people, they disagreed with secession, and then they chose to break off from and form their own territory, a territory that was still loyal to the United States. And this is how we got the state of West Virginia. But an even more interesting story unfolded in Maryland. As you can see from this map of Washington, D.C., Virginia's decision to secede from the Union put Lincoln and the entire capital city in a very precarious position. Now, that land just across the Potomac River wasn't just another state, it was another country, which is risky to say the least. Now, just imagine what might have happened if Maryland, the state north of D.C., decided to secede. Yikes! If Maryland left, then Washington would be entirely surrounded by enemy territory. And Lincoln, who had only just moved into the White House a couple of weeks ago, would have had to move right back out again. And that would have not been a good look for the new president or his administration or his country. And so, Lincoln ordered troops into Maryland to occupy it and to prevent it from holding a secession convention. And if that sounds like a kind of undemocratic, it's because it is. And Lincoln is rightly criticized for this heavy handed action. But it had the desired effect of keeping Maryland in the Union and D.C. as the United States capital. Now, after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers, it was clear that this little misunderstanding was about to blow up into a full scale war. So let's do a little pregame show where we look at the strengths and weaknesses of each side. And no matter which way you look at it, the Union has an overwhelming advantage. The North had 22 million citizens, while the South had only 5.5 million, not counting the 3.5 million enslaved people. And so that's a 4-to-1 advantage. I like those odds. When it came to the number of factories needed to make guns and artillery and uniform, the North's advantage was 9-to-1. The North had more than twice the amount of railroad track, which meant that it could quickly and efficiently shuttle soldiers to the front without having them to march. And lastly, the North already had an army, it already had a navy, it had a draft, whereas the South had to create all of those things from scratch. And so, looking at these numbers here, you might understand why Lincoln thought he might only need 75,000 troops to put down this little rebellion. But he was wrong, spectacularly wrong. Why? Well, it's complicated. Let's remember that there are no simple answers in history, but there are explanations that make sense. And here's that explanation. The Union strategy was to force the Southern states back into the Union against their will, fighting on unfamiliar territory, kind of like an away game in sports. And essentially, they were like the host of a party who discovers that half of the guests shown up, looked around, and then decided to leave. And so the host needs to follow them out into the street and then drag them back into the party, saying, "You promised you'd stay until the end." That is a tough sell. And you might understand why lots of people, North and South, said that the Union should just let those states go if they want to go. Add to that the fact that Southern states got to play a home game defending familiar territory and not needing to win a total military victory, just survive long enough to get British or French to recognize the independence of the Confederacy. And now you start to see why it might take longer than just a couple of months. Now, I don't know if you've decided on a career path yet, but just in case you're thinking of breaking off and starting your own country, let's remember this great truth. You don't need to win every battle. You just need to get some other country to recognize you as a sovereign nation. Remember, this tactic or this strategy worked for the United States in the American Revolution, and the Confederacy hoped that it would work again in the Civil War. Now, once Lincoln realized that this was going to be a legitimate war, he called on one of the heroes of the Mexican War, Winfield Scott, to develop a winning strategy. And old Fuss and Feathers did not disappoint. He presented Lincoln with what he called the Anaconda Plan, which essentially said that the Union would defeat the Confederacy much as an anaconda snake or any other kind of constrictor would encircle its prey and then squeeze it until its lungs could no longer breathe in oxygen and then crush it to death. It's pretty evocative. The snake in this question, in this particular question, would kill its prey first by establishing a naval blockade all around the South. This would make it impossible for southern states to import goods and weapons, and more importantly, it would keep it from sending cotton to Europe and or to make money that could be used to support the war effort. That's one way that we're starting to cut off the air supply for the southern states. Then Scott wanted the United States to capture New Orleans because it was the single most important city in the Confederate economy. If the blockade cut off trade with Europe, seizing the port at New Orleans would help cut off trade ties between the East and the West in the country, and it would be an important symbol of American domination. And then the armies would begin squeezing the life out of the Confederacy, closing in from the north and from the west, seizing land and taking it out of cultivation, so that the South, even if it could export its products, which it couldn't, they wouldn't be able to have any products to sell because none of the fields would be in cultivation. And that is how an anaconda would squeeze around its prey, squeeze the life out of its prey, and kill its prey. And I like to imagine Winfield Scott coming to the White House with a bunch of charts and maps and his imagery of a big old snake. And when his presentation was over, he might have been asked, well, how long do you expect this plan to take in order to win the war? And Scott responded that it might take several years. And then there was an awkward silence. Years? Years to win this war? Why go through this whole elaborate process of blockading and planning and squeezing and suffocating when the new Confederate capital was less than 100 miles away down from D.C. down in Richmond, Virginia? Just 100 miles away. Just go to Richmond and win the war. And there's another awkward silence because I kind of like to imagine Winfield Scott at this moment, kind of crestfallen, saying, "Wait, you don't like my plan? It's foolproof and it's got a great name." But the Lincoln administration favored a much more direct assault on Virginia, and poor Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, stumbled out, left bitter and rejected, and we never heard from him again, effectively. But I do want you to remember that I think probably Winfield Scott got the last laugh because after he left, Lincoln's advisors decided that, well, maybe a naval blockade was a pretty good idea after all. And eventually, the Union did decide to go down and capture New Orleans. And then guess what it did? It sent in troops, yes, from the north toward Richmond, but also from the west. And guess how long this all took? That's right, about 4 years. And yet we've forgotten all about Winfield Scott, and yet we all remember Ulysses Grant's middle initial, which is an S, by the way. So, in rejecting Scott's Anaconda Plan, Lincoln opted for the more direct route, and so it explains the Union strategy in the Eastern theater of the war: capture Richmond. And it explains the Southern strategy: protect Richmond. The goals remained the same from 1861 at the beginning of the war all the way to the war's end in 1865. So now it's time to look at some of the battles that took place in this Eastern theater. And I want to take the moment to remind you that Lord and Lady AP, they don't care about the particulars of battles and tactics. They care about beginnings and endings and turning points. And that can be frustrating, especially if you're a big fan of wars and of generals and of guns and ammunition, and you've been putting up with our discussions of the Reform era just so that you can study the First Battle of Bull Run in excruciating detail. So I'll try to just touch on some of the high points of the battles you really need to know about, and you can always ask me questions about specific battles or tactics as we move through. So let's talk about the first real battle of the war, accepting Fort Sumter. And it took place in that space between Washington and Richmond along a little creek called Bull Run. And this is why Union troops called this battle the First Battle of Bull Run. Seems kind of obvious. But wait, it gets more confusing. Because Confederates also had their own name for this battle. They called it the First Battle of Manassas because it took place along a rail line near a settlement called Manassas Junction. And as we move through this war, you'll see that lots of battles have two different names, and it usually follows this format. Union troops will call a battle after the nearest topographical feature, like a creek, whereas Confederates would tend to use the name of the nearest town, like Manassas. And so that's why the Battle of Antietam is also called the Battle of Sharpsburg, and the Battle of Shiloh is also the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, because, war is not confusing enough. But let's take just a moment to think about this battle itself, because it's kind of fun. As you can see, Union troops led by General McDowell moved south and were met at Manassas Junction by Confederate General Joseph Johnston and his troops. And here's an interesting story that speaks volumes about what people thought about the war at its onset. When General McDowell's troops left D.C. to go to Richmond, stories of their journey were published in newspapers, and folks from Washington society read about it and thought, well, this little war will be over in just a couple of months. This may be our only opportunity to see a real battle. And so True story, they packed picnic baskets and followed the Union soldiers south. And when the armies arrayed around Bull Run Creek, the Washington picnickers took up positions on the heights above the battlefield. I just love the thought of fancy people in fancy clothes with their picnic baskets and food spread out on the hillside, saying, "I'm ready to be entertained now. You may proceed with the battle." Because if the picnickers thought this was going to be an easy Union victory and a quick war, well, they learned very quickly just how wrong they were on that day. What ended up happening was that the Union Army was not only stopped on its march south, but Confederate soldiers counterattacked and forced the Union Army into a full retreat. Some reported seeing Union soldiers running in a mad sprint north toward Washington, knocking over, you would imagine, petrified picnickers in the process. So, what do we need to know about this little battle of Bull Run or Manassas? Well, a couple of things. And first of all, you have to know it was a huge, huge victory for the Confederates. And it announced that this wasn't just going to be a quick little set of skirmishes, but an actual war, a major war, requiring hundreds and thousands of men and millions of dollars of weapons and bullets and artillery. And it also convinced President Lincoln that he needed to find a better general to put in command of the army. And for this, he selected this man, Gentleman George McClellan. The fact that his name is Gentleman George, his nickname is Gentleman George, and his impressive mustache probably tells you that General McClellan was one of those people who was in it for the uniforms, not the killing. And I want to remind you that you can be in it for the killing or in it for the uniforms, and you could still be a great general, or you could be a terrible general. And let's find out which of those General McClellan is, although I suspect you probably already know the answer. On paper, George McClellan was the ideal choice to lead the army in the East. He was brilliant, he had excelled at West Point, he had a lot of experience, and he was an excellent planner and strategist. Add that to the fact that the soldiers adored him, and perhaps you can see why Lincoln thought he was the right man for the job. However, McClellan had one teeny tiny little character flaw, and it was this: he was afraid to fight. Wait, what? A general who was afraid to fight? Well, maybe that's not a fair characterization of McClellan. So let's put it this way. Essentially, he loved his troops so much that each one of them was precious to him, and he didn't want to commit them to battle unless he could be assured of victory, 100% chance of victory. Wouldn't it be nice if the Ravenscroft sports teams only had to play games when they were guaranteed a victory? But as we have learned from the fog of war, there is no certainty in war, and you can never be guaranteed a victory. And here's how this manifested itself. See if you can pick up what was going in the mind of General McClellan. Let's take a look at him again. So before committing to battle, McClellan would send scouts out to assess the strength of the army. And his scouts would come back and say something like, "Sir, there are 3,000 enemy troops out there." And McClellan's response to that was, "Really? 60,000 troops? We can't possibly attack. I need more reinforcements." Remember that the advisor had said 30,000, and he said 60,000, essentially doing a little math in his brain, always adding more numbers to his enemy, and therefore making it harder to justify attacking. No matter what his advisors told him, McClellan always just assumed that he was outnumbered, and so he wouldn't want to sacrifice troops in what he was sure would be a losing battle. And so he kept building and building his army to the point where the Union Army was well over 100,000 troops. But it still wasn't enough for McClellan, who assumed that the Confederate Army was even bigger. So, how does all this factor into that Peninsula campaign? Well, consider McClellan wanted to protect his troops, and so he didn't want to just take his army and march it straight down toward Richmond, especially because in his mind he was outnumbered. So instead, he would take his troops, put them on boats, and sail them down the Chesapeake, drop them off on a peninsula that led right up to Richmond. And yes, that's the same peninsula that has Yorktown and Busch Gardens and Jamestown, not necessarily in that order. So this plan, this peninsula strategy, would take months to accomplish, but McClellan was absolutely certain that this would surprise the Confederates, and therefore his army would be able to sneak right into Richmond without having to be engaged in a real battle with the Confederate army. So, how did it go? Not well. Predictably, the Confederates realized in like a minute that the army in front of them had suddenly retreated and sailed down the peninsula, and so all they had to do was shift over to the east a little bit, and then they were waiting for Union troops when they marched up the peninsula. And you can imagine McClellan seeing those rebel troops and thinking, oh my God, they're everywhere. Now, there were several battles east of Richmond, all won by Confederates, and eventually McClellan was forced to retreat, because he was outnumbered. Now, these battles, 7 days before Richmond and Seven Pines, might have been entirely forgettable, but for one fact. The Confederate leader, Joseph Johnston, was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines. Don't worry, we'll see him again. But command of the Confederate Army therefore got transferred to a new person. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name, General Robert E. Lee. Now, from this point on, if the Confederates were engaged in a battle in the eastern theater of the war, Lee would be in command. And Lee wasted no time at all. As McClellan was retreating back to Washington, for reinforcements, of course, Lee saw the danger of what might happen if McClellan actually met up with another Union army under the leadership of General John Pope. And so to stop that from happening, he marched his army north, where he met Pope's army along Bull Run Creek near the settlement of Manassas Junction. And so this battle, called Second Bull Run, would essentially be a replay of First Bull Run, this time pitting Pope against Lee, but the result being the exact same thing. Pope's troops retreated, and the Confederates rejoiced. And the battle had some other effects, too. First, there came to be something of an aura that surrounded the Confederate Army around this time, something almost as if they were invincible. Despite the many advantages of the Union, and we detailed those earlier, somehow these Confederates kept winning time and time again. First Bull Run, the Peninsula, 7 days before Richmond, Seven Pines, Second Bull Run, all Confederate victories. And losing repeatedly can be dispiriting to anyone. Just ask the Cleveland Browns. And so this winning streak also convinced General Lee to alter his strategy and go on offense. His logic was this: the longer the war went on, eventually the Confederates' luck would run out. And so he needed to try to do two things to bring this war to a speedy conclusion: go on offense to make the Northerners fear for their safety and pressure their government just to let the Southern states go. And two, prove to the European nations that this Confederacy was indeed viable and could win an away game, if you will. And this might lead to foreign recognition and a quick end to the war. To be sure, this was a risky strategy, and it did hurt the Confederacy's argument that they were just defending themselves against Northern aggression. But Lee saw that victory was possible, victory in the war, not just in a couple of battles. But it could only happen if he acted boldly and if he did it right now. One more thing. This man, Wilmer McLean. You might not have heard of him before, but he was the man who owned a parcel of land located along a beautiful creek named Bull Run, not so far from a railroad junction called Manassas. Before the war, this seemed to be the perfect place to put a farm. And then the Union and Confederate armies rolled in and fought the first Battle of Bull Run in his backyard in 1861. Yeah, okay, bad luck, but what are the chances that it could happen again? Well, pretty good, because the next year those armies were back, fighting in the second Battle of Bull Run. And after the troops left this time, McLean said, maybe having a farm between DC and Richmond isn't an ideal situation for me. So, we're moving. And so he packed up his family and he took them far, far away from the battlefield. And his goal was to go far enough that the war could never, ever touch them again. And McLean moved them to a new parcel of land far in the west, about 90 miles west of Richmond, into a tiny little settlement called Appomattox Courthouse. Now, something tells me we will see Wilmer McLean again. But that won't be until the thrilling conclusion of this presentation. For right now, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will see you on the other side of the screen.